And viewers, Sweden's foreign minister has called for increased pressure on Russia, urging the United States to impose additional sanctions. He's also emphasized that the European Union must act swiftly to implement a 20th negotiation sanctions package to intensify the pressure on Moscow. Meanwhile, European Union Commission President Ursula von der Leyen's advisor Kaja Kallas warned that any peace agreement with Russia must ensure the country will never launch another attack. Kallas stressed that the focus of any deal should be on Russian actions and said that meaningful concessions from Russia must be included in any peace agreement. These statements highlight ongoing European Union efforts to hold Russia accountable as diplomatic efforts for a settlement continue. Listen in to what the Swedish Foreign Minister Maria Malmer had to say.
Vi vill också att EU går vidare i arbetet med ett 20:e sanktionspaket omedelbart för att öka pressen på Ryssland. Ett 20:e sanktionspaket måste slå ännu hårdare mot ryska energiintäkter som är den främsta finansieringskällan för kriget. Precis som USA har annonserat så behöver EU också gå efter de ryska oljejättarna som Rosneft och Lukoil. Och vi behöver också se till att fler av EUs sanktionslistningar av fartyg i den ryska skuggflottan överlappar med andra partners som USA, Kanada och Storbritannien för att minska kryphålen.
And Mohammed Osman, who's an international relations expert, is joining us live from Cairo. Very warm welcome to you, Mohammed Osman, and thanks for joining us here at NewsX World. Now, with the increasing pressure of the United States on the US to ask for tougher sanctions on Russia, we have now more and more countries pressuring the United States, whether it's Germany, whether it's Sweden or the United Kingdom, even though it's not in Europe anymore. But there is pressure that's mounting on the US. Do you think it's going to have any expected outcome, especially now when we know that Witkoff has been sent off for a visit next week to Moscow?
Thank you for having me, and greetings to you and to your audience. It seems that the bigger question should be whether sanctions are viable to begin with. It's been 3.5 years since the beginning of the Ukraine war. Russia has been subjected to an unprecedented amount of sanctions, over 10 to 15,000 sanctions, if I'm not mistaken. And yet Russia has persevered, its economy did not collapse, and it's actually advancing in Ukraine and pursuing its war aims, and is basically closer to success in the Ukrainian war than ever before since the beginning of this war back in 2022. So I think that the idea that the Europeans are pushing for more and more sanctions, Marco Rubio himself, the Secretary of State, said that we have thrown everything at them basically in terms of sanctions and tariffs and whatnot, and yet it did not yield any results. So this is the American position. The United States is more interested in trying to pursue a de-escalation of the conflict in Ukraine and finding a pathway for a realistic settlement rather than actually pursue any more escalatory measures. And this is where the sharp disagreement between the Americans and the Europeans comes in, basically, because the Europeans see that the framework of the settlement that is being proposed right now by the United States and discussed with the Europeans and the Ukrainians does not satisfy the security needs and the security concerns of the Europeans, let alone the Ukrainians, of course. But of course, at the same time, what the United States is proposing is basically reflective of the situation on the ground. Russia is winning. Russia is advancing on all fronts. Russia has captured Pokrovsk, has captured Kupiansk. They are about to capture Mirnograd and other cities. They are advancing in Zaporozhye. Ukraine is suffering from a shortage of manpower. Foreign aid to Ukraine, whether military or economic, has dwindled by about 50% or 46% in the year 2025. The US is not giving as much support as it used to do anymore. Europe simply does not have the stockpiles or even the industrial infrastructure to produce the amount of weapons and ammunition needed for the Ukrainians. And even if they confiscate the hundreds of billions of dollars of frozen Russian assets, it will still be not enough to satisfy Ukraine's needs, which is estimated at around $450 billion dollars in whether economic aid or military aid in order for them to actually persevere and not collapse before the Russian attacks. So it's an arithmetic issue basically, as you can see.
But do you think that the United States is lacking a comprehensive strategy as far as Russia is concerned?
No, I think the US has a coherent plan, and this plan is very biased towards the Russians, it seems. It doesn't seem that the United States, or the Trump administration rather, or President Trump himself and a few of his close associates like Steve Witkoff and J.D. Vance and others, they are not interested in engaging in a proxy war against Russia anymore. However, there are, and therefore the 28-point plan that has been proposed basically gives Russia what it wants: Ukrainian neutrality, downsizing of the Ukrainian army. Russia gets to keep the lands it acquired, and also it gets to take over the rest of the Donbass. About 15% of the Donbass is still controlled by the Ukrainian armed forces. And of course, the sanctions will be lifted and so on and so forth. So this is what the Americans are proposing. On the other hand, they are giving security guarantees to the Ukrainians. They are not as strong as the Article 5 provisions of the NATO Charter. However, at the end of the day, they are security guarantees that will deter future Russian aggression, which makes what Kaja Kallas said the other day, basically about the Trump plan, inaccurate, because it does provide that guarantee to the Ukrainians. So I think that the Trump administration does have a coherent strategy with regards to the resolving the conflict in Ukraine. However, there are components within the current U.S. administration and the U.S. deep state and U.S. Congress who are vehemently opposed to what President Trump is doing, and they are attempting to sabotage his attempts to reach a ceasefire and a peace settlement in the Ukraine war. They are pushing for more escalation. They are pushing for the U.S. to revise its current plan to remove provisions with regards to Ukrainian neutrality and non-accession to NATO, and so on and so forth, which was basically ensure that Russia will refuse such a proposal if it is amended along such lines. So as you can see, the situation is very complicated at this point. However, I do believe that so far the Trump administration is very interested in pursuing the course of action of settling the Russia-Ukraine based on the actual variables on the ground. And Steve Witkoff is visiting Moscow next week and will meet with President Putin. And the Ukrainians are being more flexible from the reports we hear, because basically, as President Zelensky said, we have a choice either to continue and lose a valuable ally, which means Ukraine basically losing this war if they lose the support of the United States, or basically to lose, as he said, our national dignity, what President Zelensky said, which means that they will have to make very tough choices.
But Mr. Osman, there's also the question of the new arms treaty, given that the present one is set to expire in February next year. How is the U.S. going to address that?
Well, the thing is, the Russians have been very eager to actually extend the New START treaty by a year, so that there will be any armed, because it's the only remaining arms control regime between the United States and Russia that is still in force. That Russia is interested in extending it. President Trump clearly has another vision that includes a trilateral mechanism that involves Russia, China, and the United States, something that China opposes, and Russia is eager to keep that bilateral mechanism intact. However, the Trump plan does say that one of the provisions is that there will the issue of nuclear arms control will be addressed bilaterally between the United States and Russia. So if the war in Ukraine is resolved, I do not see a reason why they will not find a pathway in order to find common understandings, either to extend this treaty or to even come up with and promulgate new treaties or agreements. However, if the settlement, if the peace efforts in Ukraine hit a brick wall or a dead end, and by the way, this is very possible and very plausible actually, given the current circumstances, I think that no common understandings will be reached and the treaty will expire, and this will have very dire consequences, especially that the United States and Russia have both expressed their intention to resume nuclear tests, which basically pushes the world into a whole new territory that is plagued by so many dangers that we thought were left behind after the end of the Cold War.
Sure, but with continuous bombardments from the Russian side on Ukraine, do you think Russia is likely to accept the peace plan? Is it a way of it, in fact, rejecting the peace proposal?
I think that any arrangement that will secure for Russia Ukrainian neutrality, the partial demilitarization of Ukraine, also the departure of President Zelensky from office, and this is provided by the U.S. initiative saying that the presidential elections will be held within 100 days, and also that Russia gets to secure or maintain the territories it captured as they are in Kherson and Zaporozhye and the entirety of the Donbass along with Crimea, of course. If there is an agreement that provides Russia with these concessions or with these provisions, I think that the Russians would agree to it. Even the confiscation of Russian assets or part of them in order to use them in the reconstruction efforts in Ukraine, this is something that Russia is open to. The gradual lifting of sanctions, this is something that Russia is also willing to accept. However, and even the security guarantees that Ukraine is about to receive, including a provision that clearly states that Ukraine, if Ukraine is subjected to another invasion or attack from Russia, all sanctions will be reinstated and a coordinated military response will be carried out by NATO countries. So this is a very, very strong provision that Russia is willing to accept, in my opinion, if it is given the other concessions. So if the plan remains unchanged in the core issues in it, I think that the Russians will probably accept it, especially that they were included in coming up with this plan. There were consultations between Steve Witkoff and several Russian officials during the promulgation and the formulation of this peace plan since October, according to reports. And the Ukrainians were also included in the conversation, but the reports suggest that the Russians were consulted much more vociferously than the Ukrainians were.
Well, thanks, Mr. Osman, for joining us and sharing your opinions with us here at NewsX World. And with that, viewers, we will now shift our focus to news from the United Kingdom. Now, Britain's fiscal watchdog has apologized for publishing details of UK's Finance Minister Rachel Reeves' budget, which is an unprecedented error that stole the Finance Minister's chance to reset a growing narrative of incompetence in dealing with a struggling economy. The error sparked anger and mockery in the House of Commons and a frenzy on trading floor. The Office for Budget Responsibility, which is OBR, meant the key announcement from the budget on taxes, economic growth and individual policy changes, and were all reported an hour before Reeves stood up to deliver her budget to Parliament. Let's listen in to what Rachel Reeves had to say.
Today's budget builds on the choices that we have made since July last year. To cut NHS waiting lists, to cut the cost of living, and to cut debt and borrowing. No doubt we will face opposition again, but I have yet to see a credible or a fairer alternative plan for working.
All right, and Peter Cardillo, who is the chief market economist of Spartan Capital Securities, is joining us live from New York. Extend you a very warm welcome. I just want to begin by asking you a very broad question, which is to basically explain the new budget that's been put out and the criticism that it's receiving, especially as far as the wealth tax is concerned.
Yeah, obviously, excuse me. Obviously, you know, the finance minister unveiled the budget, and it's somewhat of a questionable one, I think. $26 billion in new taxes, and probably opens the path for lower interest rates. So I think, this budget doesn't do anything to change the credibility gap that the United Kingdom has. And so it's going to be very interesting to see how the British bond market and, of course, other markets respond to this. There was a blunder to begin with. The OBR released the budget before the finance minister presented it to Parliament. And as a result of that, the CEO of the OBR has resigned or is resigning. And so it was a calamity, so to speak. And again, I'm not sure what the real outcome. I just think that it does nothing to close the credibility gap.
Right. In fact, one of the very severe consequences that we are seeing is how high net worth individuals are planning to flee the United Kingdom. We just saw reports of Lakshmi Mittal planning to move to Dubai. What's likely going to happen in the future?
Well, I'm not sure what could happen in the future, but let's talk about what might happen with the British pound. I think that initially it's probably going to give it a boost. In fact, as I look at some of the trades right now, it's basically up against the U.S. dollar. But I think as we go forward, it's going to be negative. I think we could see the British pound drop under 130 in the coming weeks or in the coming months.
All right. And who do you think, which section is this budget really going to be helping?
Did you say recession? Did I get that right?
No, which section is the budget? Which class of people is this budget really targeted towards?
Oh, well, again, anytime you raise taxes, obviously that's going to affect spending. That's going to hold back companies from spending, and that means less growth. And so I think that's the key. Raising taxes is not the way to go, unless you accompany that by incentives for the consumers or for businesses in general. But I did not see any of that in this budget.
And what about the retirees and the long-term homeowners? How is this budget going to impact them?
Well, again, it probably means higher interest rates. So that's a negative in terms of real estate in the United Kingdom.
All right. Well, thank you for now joining us here, Peter, and sharing your perspective with us. And viewers, let's shift our focus